Good morning. This morning, as we continue the look at the old in a new way, we're looking at the story of Samson. You find this story in the book of Judges, beginning on the 13th chapter. And before we go on, I think we need to spend a moment and just talk about this concept of judges as we find them here in the Old Testament. The judges were a series of leaders who provided, for the most part, military leadership as well as spiritual leadership for the people. And there's a political aspect to how they interacted with the people. And you find that all through the Judges until you get to Samson. And Samson kind of breaks that mold in that he was a warrior for the people. But as you read the story, you see that there wasn't any spiritual leadership from Samson for his people, quite the contrary. But he was the last of the judges that are recorded in this book. And as we move on in the Hebrew history and the story of God's relationship with humanity, we move from here with Eli and Samuel. In that transition to a monarchy and having a king over the people. But we have here the story of Samson. The name Samson is man of sun, and there are some parallels to Greek mythology here in this relationship in man of the sun. Samson parents, his father was Manoah, a Danite, and Manoah and his wife were childless. And this is another story that is repeated several times in the Bible, in the Old Testament, where a childless couple has a blessing from God and a child is conceived and born. And Samson follows that pattern here in that a messenger from God appears to Samson's mother and tells her that a child is going to be born. And before that child is born, the child is set aside by God. The child is a gift of God, and the child is being set aside to serve God as a Nazirite. Now, a Nazirite vow could be entered into in the temple in the presence of God and sacrifices made. And this set a person apart for serving God. You find that in the New Testament, when Paul comes back to Jerusalem before he's arrested, he undergoes the purification and pays for the sacrifices for some other young men who are entering into a Nazirite vow. Characteristics of this vow is that your hair would not be cut while you're in this under this vow to serve God, and also that you had to remain ritually pure, or ritually clean, that is. And that meant that you could not be defiled. You could not defile yourself by coming into contact with unclean people and things, particularly a dead corpse. So Samson was set aside as a Nazirite before he was born. And then the story kind of unfolds after that. As I say, Samson does not fit that mold of a person leading the Israelite people. Samson is very self-centered in the story that's presented in the Bible. As he becomes of age, he, much to the dismay of his parents, decides to take a Philistine wife. Now, the irony here is that as the story is presented, Samson is protecting the Hebrew people from the Philistines. And here he goes and takes not one Philistine wife, but as the story continues to unfold, there's a second Philistine woman that it's not clear that they were married, But Delilah, the second who comes on the scene, was also a Philistine woman. And as the story goes on, the Philistines recognize Samson's strength and they want to defuse it. They recognize that they can't stand against him. And so they're constantly seeking how to disarm him. What's the secret of his strength? And Samson, in a weak moment, tells Delilah that the secret is in his hair. While he's sleeping, she shaves off his head, and then the Philistines come in and bind him and gouge his eyes out and take him into captivity. They're using him as a slave, having him hooked up to a mill to grind grain, walking around to move a millstone in a circle to turn a millstone to grind grain. As the story comes to an end, he's in the temple. There's a festival going on, and he prays to God, and God hears his prayer, and he asks the servant to place him between two of the pillars of the temple. And then, using the strength that God has restored to him, he causes those pillars to be collapsed, and the temple collapses on the Philistines, killing all of them that are gathered there. These are Philistine leaders, it seems, and killing Samson also. Now, is this a true story? It's recorded in the scripture, and I would say that while the academic study is all over the place, some portray it as a myth, some say it's absolutely true, and some say that it's true, but it's been exaggerated, hyperbole, which was a type of literature and a type of way of expressing that Christ himself used to make a point. Which of those is actually true? My own thinking, I come down on the hyperbole, a true story that's been exaggerated over time as it was recorded here in our scripture. The important thing that I take away from this, from the theology standpoint, is that all strength comes from God, that we are individually set aside by God to serve God, and our strength comes from God, that we are not able to achieve things, particularly things that would serve God in a way that would achieve God's goals by our own means. I know from my own life that that was something that I struggled with in being called to pastoral ministry. I knew I couldn't do that on my own. I knew I had to go back to school. Didn't know if I could do that. I not only was able to go back to school and complete the course of study at Duke, but also I thoroughly enjoyed that time, and I did very well. Well, maybe very well is an exaggeration. I did adequately to get through that, and it just reinforced the passion that I had for Bible study that continues on to this day. So, to me, the source of truth and the theology here is that the strength comes from God. Now, a little later today, Pastor Dawn will be expanding this scripture and relating it to us here at Main Street and where we are today and how this story helps us in our ministry here at Main Street, individually and corporately. So may God bless, and hope to see you with us in worship a little later this morning.